Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce. Today, we have a special pod in store for you. We've brought together several of our editors to discuss the workforce issues that they're reporting on in their various industries. So joining me today is Jim Montague, Executive Editor of Control Magazine and ControlGlobal.com, and he's also the host of Putman's Control Amplified podcast. Thanks for being here today, Jim.
Glad to be here.
We also have Pan Demetrakakes, Senior Editor of Food Processing Magazine and FoodProcessing.com here today. Thanks for joining us, Pan.
Delighted.
And last but not least, a regular interviewer here on Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce, we have Christine LaFave Grace, Managing Editor of Plant Services Magazine and PlantServices.com. Thanks for taking on the interviewee role today, Christine.
Thanks very much, Amanda.
So I know you're all quite busy, so we're just going to get started here. I guess, Jim, can you just start kind of by telling us a little bit about how the companies that you cover are dealing with the skills gap and the brain drain and, you know, all the other buzzwords that we're hearing about for shrinking workforces and other workforce issues?
Well, they're often not dealing with it very well. The skills gap, brain drain, or whatever you want to call it, has been a recurring theme in just numerous control interviews and conference sessions we've attended over the past, 10 or 12 years. This is due to the reality that baby boomers, engineers, technicians, and other experienced veterans have just been retiring in much greater numbers than they've been replaced. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but there are reportedly hundreds of thousands of skilled manufacturing jobs that are going unfilled each year. As a result, the know-how required to run many manufacturing processes efficiently has been just walking out the door, and many companies haven't been able to capture it and pass it along to new employees if they can get them. Consequently, many manufacturers have been recruiting, but they report the usual advertising, including online job boards, just don't work. One packaging machine builder, RPAC in Schiller Park, Illinois, told us a few years ago that they even put a billboard up on a nearby expressway, and it didn't produce results either, which is why it still was taking them a year to fill an engineering position. At the same time, many process and discrete manufacturers and system integrators complain that young people apparently only want to be sports or entertainment stars, lawyers or FBI agents, doctors or nurses or other jobs that they see on TV, and believe that manufacturing is just dirty if they think about it at all, and they don't want to, take on the math and science courses usually required for them to become engineers or technical professionals. There are several ways to combat the skills gap in the brain drain, but they require companies to be a lot more proactive than they've been before.
Right. Well, Pan, kind of in line with people kind of viewing these jobs as bad, Food Processing's 2018 Job Satisfaction and Salary Survey asked people about who are in the jobs what they are frustrated with. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about some of those things that people were saying that they were frustrated with in their manufacturing jobs?
Well, just to be clear, that particular article, that particular survey had more to do with the white-collar than the blue-collar workforce. And they are affected by the same trends that are affecting really American business as a whole, which is that companies want to keep costs down, and there's more competition for qualified potential employees in times of low unemployment. So as a result, a lot of positions are going unfilled. And this impacts workers in the obvious way of having to do more work. In the comment section of the survey, several respondents mentioned having an increased workload, required to handle more than one person can handle. One guy wrote, too much to do with underqualified staff, another one said. And beyond that, beyond their own personal burdens, they also, in many cases, see that it's affecting, having a detrimental effect on the company's development as a whole. 56% of the respondents said that they saw positions going unfilled, and 21% saw that and agreed with the statement that, quote, unfilled positions are constraining our capacity or preventing us from expanding. So that means that it's obviously a serious problem, a serious situation, if even the rank and file blue-collar employees can see it and are concerned about the future of the company in that context.
Sounds like it. So, Christine, Jim and Pam have kind of talked about this inability to, get people in the door. What has plant services seen in terms of getting people in the door to fill that gap and fill these open positions that everybody seems to have?
Yeah, absolutely. It's far and away the top challenge for respondents to our 2018 workforce survey. Our findings really complement what Pam was talking about with food processing survey. And as far as Jim's point, yeah, I think it was the latest 2018 numbers from the Deloitte and Manufacturing Institute study found that up to 2.4 million manufacturing jobs could go unfilled by 2028. It's a really pressing concern, and for our respondents, it's a concern right now. More than 70% of people who took our 2018 workforce survey ranked filling jobs that are open right now, finding skilled workers to fill positions that are currently open, as their top workforce challenge. The immediacy of that is notable, too, because we also asked about addressing futuring hiring needs. Planning to meet futuring hiring needs, the challenges that they'll face maybe 5 years from now as even more boomers retire. That was much less of a concern for our respondents than meeting their hiring needs today. It's a good and a bad. It's a double-edged sword with the economy as it is, and with manufacturing in particular as strong as it has been, as robust as it has been in the past year. One of the sources I actually spoke with for our story about the survey's findings was a guy named John Lavoie, superintendent of a vocational high school that's based in Andover, Massachusetts. That's part of the second industrial revolution, 130 years ago. Great textile region, and then in the second half of the last century, plants closed, jobs moved abroad, work loss was really devastating for the region. But now, different production, more high-tech production, different companies are really growing in the area. And John said that for every student in his vocational training program, every student that their program puts to work, employers in his area probably need 3 or 4 more. When I spoke to him last summer, he had a call the week before from a company that was looking for 10 students to come in and help fill the role. So the need is there. It's how to fill that need that manufacturers are really struggling with.
Right. So we've seen, we would presume, I guess, that, a lot of these people filling these gaps are going to be young people, right? That these students are generally going to be, the millennials, maybe the Gen Zers starting to come in. And Jim, I know in Control's recent salary survey, the average age was on a decline. Does this kind of exemplify trends that you were covering, in 2014, 2015, 3, 5, 10 years ago?
Well, I think it's actually been 2 years that we've begun to see a slight decline in the average age of the process control and automation engineers, system integrators, and others responding to Control's annual salary survey. To put it in a little bit of context, for many years the average age just kept climbing further up into the 50s and closer to the 60s. But given the demographics of retirement and the mathematics involved, this just couldn't continue forever. No matter what happened. So even though more rookies may finally be coming into manufacturing and, reducing a little bit the average age of the staff, the younger people still don't have the knowledge of the veterans who are retiring, which means the relative skills gap is likely as bad or, worse than ever. One other reason for the skills gap that seems to have been forgotten is that, in the 1980s and 90s, many manufacturing companies laid off large parts of their traditional internal engineering departments or closed them entirely. And then, this has also interrupted a lot of the knowledge and experience that might have otherwise have been passed along.
Yeah, I would just like to add to what Jim just said. That's certainly something that's being seen in the food industry. And one consequence is that suppliers of all sorts of equipment and even of construction services have had to jump in and do a lot of the engineering-related planning and thinking for their customers that the customers used to do themselves.
Well, great. Well, Pan, I noticed in your 2019 Manufacturing Outlook survey, food processing found that workforce issues was cited as one of the biggest concerns for food and beverage manufacturers this year. Can you give us some examples of what food and beverage manufacturers are having problems with?
Okay. Well, just to be clear, just as the job satisfaction and salary survey centered on white-collar workers, this one, the Manufacturing Outlook, was more to do with blue-collar, floor-level workforce. And at the most basic level, the problem the food industry has is just plain attracting people who want to work in a food plant. Because, to be perfectly blunt about it, a lot of those plants are very unattractive or unappealing environments. They're cold or hot. They're wet, sometimes dusty, very often noisy. The work is often dull and repetitive and can also be dangerous if you're talking about things like cutting up chicken or beef carcasses with sharp knives. And so it's just basically not easy to attract people to work in an environment like that, especially if they have other alternatives due to low unemployment and the presence of other opportunities in the area.
And that's an issue that gets into so many different difficulties. There's a story that the Washington Post did last year about a lot of these jobs, in food being filled by, in one particular plant, I think it was in North Dakota, workers who were displaced by the hurricane down in Puerto Rico, and they came up sight unseen, had never been to North Dakota before, and find themselves at a poultry processing plant, and suddenly are working in 40-degree conditions, and not speaking English as well as some of their colleagues do. The difficulties there, and I mean the company is meeting its needs temporarily in that way for workforce, but are they meeting long-term needs that way? And who's going to continue to fill those positions? And how can these employees who are thrust into a different situation, how are they able to obtain the opportunities that will allow them to advance in their career and advance in the industry if that's what they would choose?
That's a really good point, Christine. Well, I mean, you've talked about how some people are filling roles like that, but what are some solutions that you have been seeing in your reporting that industries are looking at? How are different companies and organizations trying to tackle their hiring challenges?
Sure. Well, as Jim mentioned, partnerships are a big part of it. Partnerships with schools can be highly valuable. We talk about the need for that a lot. It's a matter sometimes of getting those connections established between industrial organizations and their community schools. But getting students into the plant, or having leaders from a company go out and be mentors for a local high school robotics team, having that visibility, having that exposure can be really vital. When we look at retention, which is the other key part of the puzzle, because you have to keep them, you have to keep the people who come in your door to build that future workforce that you're going to need, right? We asked in the Plant Services Survey respondents about different things that they think their organization could be doing differently to recruit and retain talent better. The obvious ones that you'd think of, higher starting wages and better incentives or benefits, those were high on the list for respondents, but they weren't the highest. Actually, the number one thing that respondents said that their organization could be doing differently from a recruitment and retention perspective is better training and career development opportunities. So showing people the path within the organization, within the industry, letting them make lateral moves if there's something else that they're interested in exploring. Somebody's on the production floor, but they're interested in pursuing human resources or workforce development within their organization. What's the path for them there? Just showing the possibilities to illustrate that this isn't a job that you're going to be in for 30 years, because the people who are entering the workforce now, that's not what they want.
Right, that's really interesting. Well, Jim, she kind of mentioned a little bit about like partnering with schools and things like that. I know Control Global has done some coverage of STEM events and different things like that at various events that we cover. What kind of interest do you see in STEM programming in the control process automation industries? Are companies investing in this or partnering with other people to kind of encourage some STEM programming and for younger kids, younger people?
Well, the first priority for any manufacturer, of course, is to recruit and retain the people they need right now. But, many have apparently also realized that their staffing shortfalls could go on for like many, many years. So they're also trying to encourage school kids to participate in STEM programs like FIRST Robotics and, many other kinds, in other events in the hope that some will get inspired and maybe pursue technical fields later. It's really too soon to know if a lot of the STEM programs can deliver more engineers, but at least one we know of, one of the older ones has already done so. Back in 2014, Siemens staged its 10th annual Introduce a Girl to Engineering event for elementary and middle school girls at its motor controls and power components plant in West Chicago, Illinois. And because, that event was in its 10th year, the organizer and the MCC and switchboard engineering manager, Jane Beck, was able to invite one of the original 15 attendees to return.
Wow.
Her name was Elizabeth Drennan, and she'd grown up to become she was at that time a senior in computer engineering at the University of Illinois Champaign. So that's at least, one of the successes. These programs are multiplying at schools. A lot of the STEM programs are almost as popular as regular school sports, and there's just many numerous examples of that. But, apart from encouraging potential engineers, both the longer-term programs like FIRST Robotics and even one-shot events are very useful also because they let technical companies tell their larger communities that they exist, which is important because a lot of residents and families, they often don't know that these companies are there. One of the best of these programs is Endress & Hauser's annual Community Career and Education Forum, and it drew 700 or 800 students and families to its U.S. headquarters in Greenwood, Indiana this past September. The students, they take tours, they played an Are You Smarter Than an Engineer quiz game, and they got to manipulate the actual process controls on Endress & Hauser's, large process training unit. The event also was notable because I think it was at least more than 30 of Endress & Hauser's corporate partners in the area were also exhibiting at it, and this included manufacturers like Caterpillar, as well as local colleges, libraries, unions, and other organizations.
Wow.
Well, we're talking a lot about preparing people and trying to get people in the door, but, these shortages are causing real problems right now. Pan, what have you heard as far as how food and beverage manufacturers are saying that their labor shortage is affecting their businesses?
Well, basically, they're going to have to do two things. In the short term, they're just going to have to increase wages. Now, they've been resistant to that, not because they're flint-hearted capitalists necessarily, but because the food industry is extraordinarily price competitive. When you're a food processor, you can't just willy-nilly raise the price for your product because you're locked into long-term contracts with the Krogers and Walmarts of the world. You have to negotiate literally every nickel of a price increase with them. And so there's this tremendous pressure to keep wages and other operating costs down, but at the end of the day, it's just going to have to be done. It's literally the only way to override the poor conditions that a lot of food plant workers have to labor in. I call it the fear factor factor. I don't know if you all remember the TV show Fear Factor. It was this contest where people would have to do ridiculous, disgusting things like eat worms or swim in bugs, or a lot of it had to do with vermin. That's what I remember. But in any case, the point is this. They found people to compete simply because they were offering these really large prizes, 4 or 5 figure sums. And people will do just about anything if they're paid enough to do it. Now, I'm not trying to draw too strict a parallel between a game show and an employment situation, but the point is that when some people complain about not being able to find people who will do this kind of work, the unspoken part is at the wages we're willing to pay. Well, you know what? You might have to be willing to pay more. Mm-hmm. So that's the short term. The long term has to do with automation, where there is, I think, more potential in food than in almost any other major industrial sector. Food in general tends to lag behind other industries when it comes to technological innovations of all sorts. So that means that they have a lot of catching up to do, and the smarter or more forward-looking ones realize it. PepsiCo declared that it was going to allocate $2.5 billion, that's with a B, dollars, to restructure and close plants because it intends to aggressively automate and take up the slack that way. Mm-hmm. And I really think that automation over the long term is going to be the major coping strategy for the labor situation that the food industry finds itself in.
You know, that's interesting, Pan. I attended a conference last spring, and it was the same thing. I heard from a guy who's IT director at a plastic packaging maker in Massachusetts. They actually serve the food and beverage industry. But his big quote that stuck out for me was, "We can't beg for enough help." And one of their solutions was they brought in a couple of robots to fill a job. They didn't they didn't get rid of the people. It wasn't a net loss of jobs. They moved them into higher skilled, or as they say, more value added positions. But they just couldn't get people to do it. Again, it's maybe at the wages that they were willing to offer. But automation was their solution. And it's interesting to us to see because, in Plant Services Survey, we asked about concern about automation. And are you worried that automation is going to affect some or all of your job responsibilities, affect your job? More than half of people we surveyed, and again, it was broader than food and beverage, and it was encompassed both, manager, supervisor level, as well as plant floor workers. But more than half said no. They didn't see automation taking away any part of their job at all. Smaller shares, about a third, said maybe at some point, but not in the next several years. Only 10% thought that automation was going to have a real impact on their job anytime in the next few years.
Well, and I think it's interesting because we do also see a lot of coverage where automation is taking the jobs, but it seems like in this instance that Pam mentioned, the jobs were gone, so automation just kind of had to fill the job that nobody would take. Very interesting. Well, Christine, is there anything else that's kind of overlooked? Pam kind of mentioned, pay scales and you have to pay people if you want them to be doing these less desirable jobs. So is there anything else that you think, though, that gets overlooked when hiring in manufacturing?
It's interesting. It's just a big disconnect to different groups that have different perceptions, of manufacturing. Beyond some of the, low-skill jobs that do have more skills required and that offer, different paths upward within an organization, within industry. Those can be really solid, well-paying, family-sustaining jobs, if you ask the public, they don't see that. They see, a recent study came out, most people believe, the majority of the American people believe that manufacturing is critical to the American economy. It's an important part of the sector. You ask them about their perceptions about, the future of manufacturing jobs or where they see the industry going. They don't see them as high-paying jobs, number one. They see automation coming in, number two. They're wary of getting into a field or encouraging their kids to get into a field where they don't see a lot of potential, even though they're saying at the same time that it's crucial to the economy. So I think one of the things that we hear, we heard it at an industry event at an Emerson Exchange event a couple of years ago, getting through to parents, beyond going to schools and partnering with schools, hosting manufacturing open houses that are open to the entire community and talking specifically maybe at career nights to parents about these are opportunities that are available in manufacturing today. They're not necessarily the opportunities that you're familiar with. And yes, automation is coming in and it's a piece of the puzzle as well. But here's where jobs are headed. Here's where the new jobs will be. That, from what we've heard, is critical too in building that talent pipeline. Because, kids still, some of them listen to their parents for guidance at some point. Whether it's parents or it's counselors at high school, you got to be aware of the opportunities that are available right now and are going to be available tomorrow.
Right. And, especially at those key ages when they're trying to make that decision of, am I going to go to college? What am I going to do? Just about to leave high school. Jim and you have discussed, especially in my local Joliet Junior College has a great program for control engineers that Jim has talked to me about. And I wanted to ask you, Jim, how do you see junior colleges and community colleges playing a role in filling the gap? I feel like a lot of those local places that offer, hands-on training programs.
Well, way back when I was a general assignment reporter for some of the weekly newspapers in the Chicago suburbs, I often covered local community colleges along with the other school districts in my communities. And I remembered that one of their primary missions was to develop courses that could give interested students the skills needed by local businesses. Over the years, Control magazine has also covered the emergence of Foundation Field Bus and the other networking protocols, and the skills needed to implement those were taught at many regional technical colleges like British Columbia Institute of Technology, Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and Trine University in Angola, Indiana. So as a result, when I began researching the skills gap in control and automation, I naturally checked if some of the community colleges, universities, and even the high schools were trying to fill it, and sure enough, they were. But it takes going out and looking for it, and not just like waiting for somebody to be attracted to what you're doing. The other thing was some colleges like Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina, reported that they're even combining their math, science, computer, and other technical courses into multidisciplinary packages that are a lot more approachable for students, and then combining them with hands-on internships at local companies. Probably the most vibrant program that I have run across is the one that Amanda brought up at Joliet Junior College near Chicago. And they began partnering a few years ago with members of the ISA's Will DuPage chapter to develop their 2-year Process Control Instrumentation and Technology program, PCIT. The striking thing about this hands-on program is that local manufacturers like Aux Sable, Flint Hills Resources, ExxonMobil, and LyondellBasell, and others along the Interstate 55 corridor, southwest of Chicago, is they didn't just tell the Joliet Junior College what they wanted, or advise them on curriculum or contribute equipment, which are all good starting positions. But these companies actually had a few veteran engineers from their companies come in to JCC and help teach some of the PCIT courses themselves.
That's great.
This was genuine, direct passing along of crucial skills, but it also introduced the companies themselves to students that they might want to hire when they graduate. This can be an excellent way to fill the skills gap and begin to solve some of those staffing shortages. But the thing that it requires is really getting out into the community and participating in bringing in that next generation.
Right. Pam, kind of in line with that, for Jim, their training happens kind of that way. But in food and beverage, what sort of training do the employees need on, the complex machinery and stuff? How do they get that? Is there programs?
Ideally, it's just on the job. I mean, you can talk about junior colleges and so forth and so on, but at the end of the day, companies really have to do it themselves. Good companies have onboarding and training programs that are specifically tailored to tasks and that are designed to make employees as comfortable with the job as possible. In 2004, there was a book published called The Working Poor by David Shipler, and among the experiences he wrote about, he talked about a woman who got a job in a food company, a food plant, a bakery, and was just thrown into the job with no training whatsoever. It says here, on-the-job training could be summed up in a single command: copy the worker next to you. I'd like to read an excerpt from that book. It says, no sooner had Deborah learned the packing task than she was yanked again into panic when a supervisor abruptly assigned her to a machine that she was untrained to operate. I didn't even know the name of the machine, she said. I just happened to hear them say, you be number 2. I was like, what you all be talking about? Number 2 was indeed the name of the machine, a huge piece of equipment that somebody needed to flip switches, Deborah explained. You have to feed the bags in, make sure the Ziplocs that close the breads is on. You have to set the machine a certain way. She was having nightmares. I'm still disoriented because I can't think. All I keep doing is feel like I'm floating because of this machine. I done had dreams where my supervisor was fussing because this didn't go right. You know what I'm saying? This job came home with me. This doesn't make sense for this little $7. Well, that's outrageous, okay? Somebody who made a lot more than $7 an hour should have sat down and figured out how to train new employees on new machinery so that people like this woman don't have to go through that kind of stress. That's not only cruel, it's extremely counterproductive. Basically, when a company ignores training, they're just kind of pushing the problem downhill. They're saying, we don't want to deal with it, we're just going to make the floor workers sweat it out. Well, that is a very bad way to do things, and as I said, the smart, well-organized companies realize that, and realize that at the most basic level, they have to do the training themselves. So on-the-job training is I think, really the single most important aspect of making sure that workers do the job right.
Well, and especially in a time of low unemployment, when you've got decades low unemployment, that's bad. It's like a bad customer service experience. If you have a bad experience with an employer, you're going to go out and tell people about it. You're going to recommend that people don't go there. And in an era of, Glassdoor.com and reviews of companies and just regular old word of mouth, talk about shooting yourself in the foot not to give employees the training and resources they need.
Well, Christine, kind of going on that a little bit more, in plant services, you break down your responses in your survey for managers and supervisors versus those on the plant floor. Were there any other, any differences that really stuck out to you, or, anything else kind of like on this, making sure that the supervisors are seeing what's happening lower down?
There are a couple of differences. For the most part, things kind of trended the same. The couple of areas where there were significant differences in responses between Group A, managers, supervisors, and Group B, those on the plant floor and the warehouse, were number one with knowledge capture and transfer. Knowledge capture and transfer was seen as an even bigger need by those on the ground and those, presumably are responsible for transferring those hard skills to the newer workers who are coming in. Number two, maintaining communication and trust between different departments. So, trust and communication between the maintenance department and the IT department, and overcoming some of the hurdles about, if IT saying, I got to run an update, we need to do patches for CMS or EM systems, and we got to, shut down a line or something. Well, okay, but we also have to, then the other side with production, we got to produce product. At the end of the day, we're on the line for whether we're going to meet our production targets, and you're telling me that we have to slow down so you can do a computer thing. That's an area where there's a little bit of a disconnect, and the need for better communication is more readily apparent for those on the ground necessarily than those in the higher offices. Otherwise, things trended pretty much the same in terms of needing skilled workers to fill positions that are open right now, and then addressing some of these longer-term challenges.
Awesome. Well, Jim, are there any encouraging signs at all that you're seeing for manufacturing workforces, especially in the industries that you cover?
Well, as I probably mentioned a little bit before, the skills gap and the brain drain are not insoluble problems. They just require some practical initiative and, good old get up and go. Our prior coverage included a good to-do list that end users, process control engineers, system integrators, and others can undertake to develop, recruit and retrain new engineers, technicians, and operators. The most useful steps include just seek out and form relationships with local community colleges, universities, high schools, and other organizations, that can be potential sources of new engineers. Participate in job fairs and other events, let them know you're there. Second, check if local curriculums teach the skills your personnel are going to need. Advocate for needed changes, maybe help develop some of the new courses, and, like Joliet Junior College did, maybe, go and help teach some of them if that's a possibility. Third, you want to set up internship and apprenticeship programs if you can that teach students graduates and back to work folks about your company's technological approach and strategies by having them learn and perform some of the basic jobs and then gauge their employability, with increasingly challenging tasks. Four, try and offer plant tours and open house events for local communities to let parents and their children know about the company, so they'll begin to think of it maybe as a place where skilled technical jobs might be one day available to them. 5, ask industry trade shows to let in more school groups and youngsters so they can get a taste of, all the technologies available. I was always kind of amazed that, there was age restrictions on a lot of trade shows. They wouldn't let kids and families into those, so they should change that. And finally, if it's possible, sponsor and mentor, local STEM programs such as FIRST Robotics, and that way each side will get to know each other better and maybe benefit from, their presence in the future.
Pan, what about you? Is there anything you're seeing that's encouraging, or any issues that you think should be maybe covered a little bit more, or companies need to be paying more attention to?
Well, I would like to come back to the issue of automation for this reason. One of the long-term consequences that we actually have been seeing for a while, and I think that will accelerate in the future, is that not only will the number of jobs decline over the long term, but the nature of those jobs will change and become more challenging and more involved. In other words, we'll be seeing maybe not so much of somebody standing at a conveyor belt all day chopping off chicken wings or whatever, and more of a person who maybe has responsibility for several lines and troubleshooting as problems come up, keeping them all running. One of the responses in our manufacturing survey was that we asked about strategies to optimize asset use, And the first response, the first option they chose was on-the-job training, which I've already talked about. And the second one was routine maintenance duties are being assigned to machine operators. So in other words, the machine operators don't just stand at the machine all day and regulate it. They have to actually fix things that go wrong, jams or whatnot. So I really think that trend is going to accelerate, and that workers will have to become more versatile, know things like PLCs and other controls, maybe other kinds of electronics, robotics, maybe even HVAC maintenance. They'll have to take on more roles, and this, I think, is actually a positive trend because, number one, it'll make the jobs more interesting, more fulfilling. People won't be doing the same thing all day for 8 hours, and therefore it'll be a little more stimulating. And second of all, they'll be more productive on an individual basis, which means that their compensation will have a basis to go up. So I really think that the increased versatility that automation is going to demand, if it's handled correctly, could have positive, aspects and outcomes for individual workers.
Well, that's good. At least we have some positive viewpoints on automation. Well, Christine, and what about you for your final point? Was there anything that you think that should be looked at more, or anything else worth mentioning?
I just echo, we're seeing exactly what Pan has indicated, and it's a really interesting time to be covering this industry, and a really interesting, it's kind of cliche to say that it's at a sort of a transformation point, but gosh, it'll be interesting to see where things go in the next, several years. It's where jobs evolve and how the industry itself changes, and just an exciting time to be a part of it.
Well, great. Thank you so much, everyone, and it was all very enlightening. Thanks again to our editors for joining us here today on Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce and sharing their insights. Thanks, of course, to our listeners for joining us today. We will be sure to include links to some of the coverage we discussed today in the show notes, so be sure to check those out for additional info you might find interesting. And don't forget, of course, to subscribe to Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. I'm Amanda Del Buno for Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce, and we'll see you next time.